Although we've seen the migration previously on 4 different occasions, this trip was to be the culmination of our visits to Africa over 14 years. First of all though, let's concentrate on the wildebeest and the journey they make in their annual migration of anything up to 3,000 kilometres. Our safari, starting in the northern Serengeti, began on the 6th of August, which we thought would be the ideal time for us to see the migration as it progressed north to the Masai Mara. But not this year. The good rains and grass further down in the Serengeti had detained the wildebeest a little bit longer. But whilst it's always tempting to focus on the river crossings, there's a whole world to the migration beyond that, and that's what this video is going to try and show. Serian Serengeti North Camp, where we were staying, is ideally located close to the Kogatendi Bridge, which enables easy access to both north and south banks of the Mara River. Now looking a lot quieter than it did in July after the very heavy rains, when for a short period the bridge had to be closed. There's undoubtedly something really quite special about the river. Its changing moods, the noise and the challenge it represents to the animals. So it's no wonder it plays such a central role in the migration. From the plane bringing us in from Lusoma, it looked as if the area was actually bereft of animals. But once on the ground it was soon obvious that the wildebeest were here, but in small groups and quite widely dispersed, after crossing the river on their journey towards Kenya. But where there are prey, you can be sure the predators will not be far behind. This young male and his brother, not far away, were relaxing while it was raining, but were keen observers of what was happening in front of them. The annual circular journey of the migration takes the wildebeest through the territory of more than 3,000 lions living in the Serengeti ecosystem, so danger is ever present. Next morning we were treated to a wonderful African sunrise, and we were full of anticipation for what the day would bring. Oblivious to the migration though, this breeding herd gave us a very close inspection and soon put a protective shield around the youngest calves. By mid-morning it was quite clear that the wildebeest were gathering near crossing point 4 and looked as if they might try and cross the river. In the Serengeti the rule is quite clear that no one can move forward to the river edge until the crossing actually begins. This means you will miss some of the crossing at first, but at least the animals have the space to decide what they want to do. With the plains now empty of wildebeest, we set off in the afternoon to find the local lion pride. They are led by a coalition of 6 males, and whilst we didn't find all of those, we did find 2 of their females and some delightful cubs. Next morning we'd not long crossed the Cogatendi Bridge when we heard this lion calling from some distance away. He's one of the 6 lions that lead the local pride. But as nobody responded, he got up after a while and wandered off into the bush. The scenery in the northern Serengeti is not only beautiful, it's also very readily accessible. On this particular morning it also brought us a very unusual sighting. Marching ants, although individually small, as a colony are a force to be reckoned with and should be treated with great care. Although they have poor eyesight, they can detect their prey by movement. A colony can be up to 50,000 strong, and collectively they can carry an enormous weight by breaking their prey down. They do this by slicing up their prey with their mandibles and dissolving it by secreting acid. For me, just the mention of the Mara River evokes a vision of the migration, but its source lies far away from here in the Mau Escarpment in Kenya. The river flows 395 kilometres into Lake Victoria. On its journey, it's a barrier, a bringer of death, and of course the source of life. Unlike 2017, when we saw the migration in the southern Serengeti, the grass and rains had been good in 2018, as a result of which the big herds were taking longer to reach the northern border with Kenya. It wasn't until late morning that we eventually found one of the characteristic long lines of wildebeest heading north, and possibly to crossing point number 2. At first everything seemed quiet, and the herd moved slowly forward to a place where they could easily descend the bank to the river. What they obviously hadn't noticed is not 100 yards further to the left, 2 young male lions were lying in long grass. After a short lull, and despite the obvious dangers, they were so desperate to cross, they returned once more. But not for long, as the impatient lions had shown themselves too soon. The wildebeest had plenty of time to turn away. Apart from a thirst for seeing the wildlife, it's also important to enjoy the environment. None more so than the sunrise and the sunset. On this occasion it was pure gold. However, not all the wildebeest got away, as next morning we found the cubs again, now feeding on the previous night's kill. For them this is an important learning exercise in eating meat, even though they're still suckling from their mothers as well. In the Serengeti, the crossing places don't have names, they have numbers, starting at 0 up to 10. This small herd are heading south, and they're heading for crossing point 3. As before, we had to wait until the crossing had actually started before we could move, so getting to the bank quickly is important, but potentially hazardous, with so many trucks seeking a good vantage point. Mega herds or not, out here on a beautiful morning, enjoying the wide open spaces and the big skies, it's humbling to think the national park ecosystem is the oldest on the planet. At this point on our morning's journey, we were very close to the Kenyan border, when faintly at first we heard a cheetah calling. In the long grass he was extremely hard to find, but eventually we found him from his call, searching in vain for his brother. In the 30 minutes or so that we were with the cheetah, he never stopped calling for his brother. Although they weren't actually that far apart, it wasn't until the following day that they were reunited and they were seen hunting together. On our way back to camp, not only did we find this long line of wildebeest, but also a male and 2 lionesses who were preoccupied in finishing off the previous night's kill. After marking his territory to demonstrate his dominance over the lionesses, he kept them away till he'd eaten his fill, repeatedly turning them back when they came near the carcass. Although his manner was still threatening, he did eventually allow them to eat the remains of the carcass, before moving away and suddenly using his phlegm in response, presumably to smell one of the female's urine to see if she was in estrus. Presumably he didn't find the scent he was looking for, because with that he turned and left, as did we, to join the next stage of our journey back to Kenya and to the Masai Mara. As we flew into Governor's airstrip, it was soon clear that the bulk of the migration had not yet reached the Central Plains. So the predators will be hungry and just as anxious as we were to see the herds arriving. The marshes around Governor's Camp are usually home to a wide variety of wildlife, though these days the marsh pride that used to dominate the area is fragmented and not the force it used to be when Big Cat Dari was being presented from here. Not far from our camp at Sarian's Nkorombo on the Mara River lies another favourite location for leopards, on the banks around the Tarlik River. It was here in 2009 that we saw Binti, very close to Rakero Camp. Big Cat fans will know that Binti was the daughter of Olive, who in turn was the daughter of Bella, probably the most well-known leopard in the whole series. When we were here in 2013, we were lucky enough to see one of Binti's daughters, with her own cubs. Now in 2018, again close to the Tarlik River, the lineage continues with Binti's daughter, who also now has her own cubs, although they were safely tucked away in the riverbank. She was very patiently strolling alongside the river, listening carefully for her cubs, but by now a lot of trucks had assembled, so we decided to leave her to it and move away. Next morning, as the balloons were taking off for their dawn flight, we were again at the Tarlik River, heading up to the Burangat Plains in the hope of seeing wildebeest herds coming up from the northern Serengeti. It didn't take long for us to realise that the still morning air was punctuated by the sound of the hyena, jackals and vultures squabbling over a nighttime kill. Thirsty after their nighttime journey, these wildebeest were stopping off for a quick drink before moving on to cross the Tarlik and Mara rivers. For the animals, there's strength in numbers, especially when facing the ruthless predators on the savannah. The relationship thrives because the two species graze on different parts of the same grass, and so are not in competition. Although it's common for them to undertake the migration together, this was the first time on our trip that we'd seen them in a combined herd. The hyena den was surprisingly close to where the wildebeest had been drinking, and this young cub which the mother's carrying in her mouth is obviously not very old because its fur is still very dark. They won't get their spots until they're at least 3 to 4 weeks old. The hyena were not the only active predators about. This cheetah was, like the wildebeest, looking for water. Her needs were all the more acute though when we noticed that she had a limp on her back leg. If she can't run, she'll be unable to hunt, making herself very vulnerable on the open plains. The herd that we had been following had moved on, and for a while the plains were empty, until we found another group not far from Serena Lodge. But by now it was late in the afternoon and very unlikely that a crossing would take place. After a couple of days of quite gusty conditions, the balloons are up in force this morning. We counted at least 18. Whilst they certainly add something to the scene, I can't help but feel they're rather incongruous in such a beautiful setting. It's estimated that at least 250,000 zebra also migrate with the wildebeest, but no one seems exactly sure quite why they do it. Maybe it's just simply a matter of safety provided by the additional numbers. But I think their characteristics are different, although clearly it's a very symbiotic relationship. This sighting is just one example. There was nothing obvious that triggered the stampede in the first place. Simply instinct told them that if the zebra were running, they need to run as well. Yet when calm returns, it's the wildebeest that walk onto the river, leaving the nervous zebra behind. Despite seeing a number of fragmented groups of wildebeest, we'd so far not seen any of the megaherds that we'd hoped for. That is, until on our third day we travelled southeast into the Mara Triangle, where in the distance we could see the long black trails of wildebeest making their way up from the Serengeti. It took us a while to catch up with them, but with no other trucks in sight, we soon found ourselves right on the edge of the herd, running in all directions on their way north. The journey back to camp via the Tarlit Gate was largely uneventful, until we got back to the Central Plains, where, close to a small group of wildebeest, we found a member of the Vaquero pride on a hunting trip of her own. She was either inexperienced or not seriously hunting, as she made little effort to hide herself in the long grass, and was soon seen and challenged by the impala. With the element of surprise gone, she quickly gave up and simply melted away in the grass. Next morning, though, the ladies of the Vaquero pride were out again, enjoying warming up in the morning light. The big cats were obviously in relaxed mood, but we wanted to move on to see if we could find again the big herd we'd seen on the previous day, perhaps somewhere near the river. No one expects to be alone at a river crossing, but we were not prepared for the sight and sound of more than 100 trucks on our side of the river and another 50 or 60 on the other side. Many of these were occupied by day trippers, probably from Nairobi, who are clearly either unaware or don't really care about the park rules. A large proportion of the vehicles are open-top minibuses, containing large groups with a driver, not a guide, who doesn't always understand the etiquette of how to behave at a river crossing. These vehicles are effectively unregulated, so it's no wonder that the mayhem, jostling for position and general noise blocked the crossing to no one's advantage. Least of all the wild animals that we'd all come so far to see. In the end, we all lost out because of the behaviour of a few. The wildebeest understandably turned and dispersed. My personal view is that if nothing is done about the problem, it will kill the very thing that keeps the park at the centre of the migration each year. As soon as drivers and guides saw the herd starting to move on, they chased after them, and we were overtaken by 3 trucks travelling at dangerously high speed. But with no rangers in attendance, there was no one to stop them. At this point, we abandoned the position to follow a smaller group to a much quieter location. In fact, on arrival, quite a few wildebeest were crossing in the opposite direction. But even here there was competition for space, so viewing was not easy or quiet. The key to watching wildebeest is patience. As they move to and fro, you begin to wonder if they will ever cross, and then suddenly, for no obvious reason, they decide to go. Apart from the hazards of the steep banks, the river also contains many crocodiles, one of whom claims a victim who had not seen it lurking beneath the surface of the river. The crocs kill their prey by drowning them, so much as the wildebeest struggles. The croc is holding fast to its legs under the water. The arrival of the second croc seals its fate. Understandably, that was enough to stop the crossing in its tracks, at least for a while. But the pressure of more wildebeest arriving eventually makes the herd take the risk again. With all the determination in the world, this wildebeest is going to find it extremely difficult to scramble up this bank with a broken leg. But he is certainly going to give it a try. His best option would have been to stay on dry land, but somehow he's fallen back into the water, an action which will almost certainly seal his fate. There is no glory in this sight. It's just one page of the migration story, which the river will soon wash away, ready for the next chapter.